Thanks everyone for coming. Really nice to see some different faces in the audience, so I really hope you enjoy today's seminar. So today we have Ross Kingwell, who is currently the Chief Economist at the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, which is a joint initiative of the WA Agriculture and Food and Grains R&D Corporation. And we're also lucky to have Ross as a professor here in our school, the School of Agriculture and Resource Economics. I'd just like to also point out that today's seminar is also co-sponsored by the Australian Agricultural and Resource Economics Society.
Okay, so let's begin. So I'm going to talk to you about a report that's available. I've got a few copies here, but it's available online if you just do a Google search for AGIC and supply chains. To give you just a feel for Australia's grain supply chains, on the left of this overhead is the grain flow. So the grain flow is basically from farm and then it makes its way eventually onto ship. So that's the flow of grain. On the right-hand side is actually the price signals that accompany that flow of grain at various points in the supply chain. And that's one thing to bear in mind, that when you're talking about the price of grain, immediately people then say, which price? Are you talking about the FOB price, the FIS price, the silo price, the farm gate price? And that's really important when it comes to costing and describing grain supply chains, to be aware of what happens at each stage in the supply chain. So the rationale, why should we bother to estimate the cost of Australia's grain supply chain? It is what it is. Why do we need to bother investigating its costliness? Well, for Australian farmers in particular, the cost of their supply chain is very important because farmers have little ability to influence the sale price of their grain on international markets. So their farm gate price is directly influenced and affected by the costliness of their supply chain. So if you take all the costs of the supply chain away from the price on the international market, you end up with a farm gate price. And the cheaper your supply chain, the higher your farm gate price. So supply chain costs do matter to farmers because they directly affect their farm profitability, they affect their farm gate price. And the other aspect of why a less costly supply chain is worthwhile is it actually affects farmers and taxpayers' investments in grains R&D. Because under legislation, farmers are required to invest in grains R&D through a levy, which is 1.02% of their farm gate price. So the higher the farm gate price, the more farmers invest in grains R&D. And because of the matching arrangements, it also means there's more money likely to be provided by taxpayers if the farm gate price is higher. The other issue too is that if you look forward, we know that towards 2050, 65% of the estimated 110 million tonne increase in global wheat trade is going to occur in regions adjacent to Australia, in Asia and the Middle East. And if we want to capture some share of that growth in wheat trade, then we need to be internationally competitive. And part of international competitiveness is having cost structures that make you competitive. So what was our method of examining grain supply chains in Australia? We firstly used publicly available data That, by the way, does not mean that it's easily accessible, but it is publicly available if you hunt for it. We also used the test case to provide spatial uniformity of looking at the situation of a farm being 200 kilometres from its nearest port, and we put together a process whereby all our data was reviewed by bulk handlers independently to assess its accuracy, and we also had long discussions with industry representatives to make sure that our data estimates were valid. So before we went to press, we had a system in place to make sure that our data was, as far as possible, accurate. And this is what we ended up with. So we end up with supply chains in different regions, with, on the vertical axis being the dollars per tonne associated with that supply chain. And the cheapest supply chain is in Western Australia, and under the sets of assumptions we use, the most expensive supply chains are in Queensland and South Australia. And there are some similarities and differences between the regions, and I'm just going to expand. So firstly, if you look back, one of the actions of John Kerrin when he was Minister for Agriculture was that he set up a Royal Commission into Grain Storage and Handling in 1988. That was headed up by the recently deceased Jim McColl, who, according to Al Watson, was the best AFL footballer ever to become an agriculture administrator. and that Royal Commission had available to it, under the powers of the Royal Commission, access to some wonderful data sets, and they employed some exceedingly clever people such as Brian Fisher, John Quiggin, Bob Linder. Later, Donna Brennan worked on some of the data sets. Gordon McCauley, Bob Badham. So there was a group of agricultural economists in this Royal Commission who were able to do some very detailed investigations of supply chains. And what they found was that in 1986 and 87, supply chain costs in Australia were about 33 and 31% respectively in those 2 years of the FOB wheat price. Now, interestingly, if you go back and have a look at their data sets and you remove the cost of AWB administration and financing costs, because remember this was a heavily regulated supply chain and AWB charged some significant costs for its administration and financing of the pool price. Although pooling is now available, a lot of sales are cash-based. So if you remove the AWB costs, you find that supply chain costs were 21 and 24% of the wheat FOB prices. And in our study for 2013-14, we found that the current supply chain costs across Australia are about 18 to 23%. So, prior to deregulation, grain supply costs were actually a bigger chunk of the FOB price than they are now. And yet, if you look at newspapers and talk to farmers, farmers are constantly complaining about their cost structures, whereas in fact, in relative terms, their supply chain cost structures have gone down. One of the significant benefits of deregulation, particularly to WA growers. Having put up that graph of supply chain costs, I'm going to immediately say be very careful, because there's a huge risk of comparing apples with oranges. That the supply chain costs in each jurisdiction have some important differences. And here are some of the differences. Firstly, in the different jurisdictions, the nearest silo to a farm differs. So the smallest distances are in Victoria and South Australia. Queensland has the biggest distance that a farmer needs to travel to deliver their grain from farm to their receival point. Then the median distance of receival point to port differs significantly. One of the interesting factors that you may not be aware of is that WA growers actually cart their grain less than a Victorian grain grower, because a lot of the grain grown in Victoria is from their northwest, and it's actually further from port than you might expect. And the other difference is there's huge differences in the mode of transport between different jurisdictions. In New South Wales and WA, we are more reliant on rail. And there are rapidly changing trends. So in Victoria, at the moment, almost 60% of grain is going by road. So I want to start with some findings and reflections and then just fill them out. The first is that obtaining costs of the various segments is likely to become increasingly difficult. So cost transparency is likely to diminish, and I'll explain a bit about why that is so. So what we've done is going to be increasingly difficult to do, I suspect. It was possible under the Royal Commission because of their powers. It's very difficult to do. We found the task of actually finding data to be very difficult. The other issue, and I'll explain this in some detail, is the low density of production and the high volatility of production in regions of Australia increases the cost of Australia's grain supply chains. And some of those features are truly unique to Australia, and unfortunately the nature of the beast is that we end up with more expensive supply chains. Another issue that arises is that past dependencies and policy rigidities have played and will continue to play an important role in both distorting the nature and the costliness of our grain supply chains. The good news is contestability in our grain supply chains is increasing. In conversations with farmers, the last point is a really important one, and I think it's a weakness of our report, is that we have concentrated on cost rather than saying the supply chain is a bundle of services. And that shows up in a lot of farmers' comments that they see their supply chains as a line item, as a cost, not as a service. It's a, in the human relations field, it's like seeing an academic as a cost item in a balance sheet rather than as a provider of services. It's just how you view that resource. Okay, cost transparency is diminishing. It's diminishing because historically we had a lot of the service providers being government agencies that through their annual reports and through the nature of their staff were fairly open to divulging what was going on in their business structures. Through time, there's been aggregation and privatisation. So we've had very recently Glencore purchase Viterra, Viterra being a Canadian firm. You've had Cargill's, big multinational, come in. You've had ADM try and take over Cargill. So these are big multinational companies. So when it comes to Viterra, if you try and find out what the costs of the South Australian operation is, this is the entire South Australian operation, it's a single line item in their annual reports. That's how opaque it is. Even after we've released the report, some of the available data sets have been taken off websites. I shouldn't infer causality, but I've been told informally that there is. So if you look what's happened in the different parts of the supply chain, what you find is that they are dominated by private firms, increasingly dominated by large multinational firms. And it's not in their self-interest and it's not in their business to provide information. I want to contrast that with Canada. When Canada deregulated, they, under statute, required that their grain supply chains be monitored. And the tender for monitoring was awarded to a company known as Quorum Corporation, and Quorum Corporation are, under legislative mandate, able to provide information about the nature of the grain supply chain in Canada. All efficiency metrics, all costings are transparent. When we deregulated in Australia, we lost all ability to monitor performance. Okay, the second point, Australia's low density of production increases the cost of its grain supply chains. If you look globally, what you find is that there are major grain growing regions of the world, such as the soybean, corn belt, parts of Europe, much of India, much of Argentina, are crop dominant farming systems, hugely crop dominant farming systems. So their land intensity is extreme. In parts of Australia we're heading that way, but we still run these mixed enterprise systems where you've only got 60 or 70% of your farm area in crop. So our cropping intensity is less, and that has important implications for the provision of grain handling storage infrastructure when you have less intense land use devoted to cropping. Then you've got the issue that also feeds into production intensity, I should say production density. We just happen to be a producer of wheat varieties in environments that unfortunately are low yielding by international comparisons. So our production density, both with respect to land use intensity and yield levels, delivers low density grain production. That's just the nature of grain production in Australia. Complicating this is that not only do we have low densities in grain production, but we also grow our grain in environments where they tend to be winter crops and there's only one crop a year. Now, apart from Queensland, Northern New South Wales, where you do have summer crops and winter crops, most of our grain production is a winter crop. So you only get one harvest. And that again has implications for the frequency of use of transport, handling and storage infrastructure. And in many parts of Australia, the low density problem is compounded, particularly for rail owners and operators, because grain revenues are their sole source of revenue. So you're running a business and your business is entirely dependent on grain production, and that grain production is low density. So that has implications for the volumes of grain that you carry per kilometre travelled. The other issue is that production volatility increases the cost of Australia's grain supply. If you do international comparisons, you find that the coefficient of yield variation in Australia is basically a world leader. We just have phenomenal variation in yields. And that tends to lead to investment in underutilised capacity. So storage, you have to construct storage and handling and freight systems available or capable of dealing with very large harvests, only to find those very same assets underutilised for periods of time, such as the Millennium Drought in New South Wales and Victoria. So you've got an investment in underutilised capacity, so high fixed costs, which unfortunately have to be captured in the supply chain cost. It also complicates logistics planning and management. This huge volatility. I've had discussions with CBH, and this issue of logistics planning and management, when they get it wrong, it costs them millions of dollars. It's very difficult to get it right because of both the temporal and the spatial variability of grain production. In a paper by John Quiggin and Horowitz, one of the issues that they looked at, and it is relevant particularly in Western Australia, where there's some pretty strong evidence of a drying climate, is that one of the issues of drying climate and volatile climate is that there's a high risk of asset stranding. So you've got these storage systems that are built to last 30 to 40 years, and if over that 30 to 40 years you get a drying climate and you get a switch away from grain production, or you get less grain production because of the drying climate, then again you risk stranding those assets, and certainly you get less return from those assets that you would have anticipated in the absence of drying. The other issue, and this particularly affects rail, is that you increase the risk of asset degradation. If you get a period of low volume years, then the owners of those particularly below rail assets have very little incentive to invest in maintenance because they're just not making money out of these underutilised assets. And so those assets end up being degraded, and that's what's happened across Australia. The rail infrastructure has rapidly degraded. That's an example of yield volatility. This is an example of spatial volatility. So this is last season. So you could see some of the dilemma of a CBH and why it's easy to get things wrong. You had parts of the northern grain belt having very low yields in sort of below the 15th percentile. Then you had other areas like down Esperance Way where they had phenomenal yielding years. So being able to correctly anticipate the allocation of staff spatially and do that in a cost-efficient way is a real challenge. So CBH has 1,000 full-time staff but 1,500 casuals. Knowing where to place those casuals is a challenge. The other issue is just the volatility of export volumes, that we have a pretty constant domestic market, and that's principally in Eastern Australia, so it's a difficult overlay. You've got volatile production, a pretty constant domestic market. When you overlay a volatile production with a constant domestic, you end up with a hugely volatile export volume. The other issue that I want to quickly touch on are path dependencies and rigidities. One of our past dependencies is that there were decisions made in the 19th century, yes, the 19th century, and the 20th century that have delivered to us as a nation 3 different rail gauges. In 1970, if you wanted to go from Perth to Brisbane, you had to change your rail 7 times. And what the problem is of these different gauges is that you can't move your rolling stock spatially. You can with harvesters. You know, in Eastern Australia, contract harvesters move from north to south. So they follow the grain harvest down. The rolling stock can't. So each region has to have its set of rolling stock. So you've embedded inefficiencies in the strategic and tactical use of this very important and expensive bit of infrastructure. So here's all our different rail gauges. West Australia and Queensland narrow gauge, Victoria followed the Irish and went broad gauge, and New South Wales went standard. And the other issue is that rail line construction was mostly influenced by politics, not economics. So you had New South Wales grain from its northwest and southwest regions being forced to run to a New South Wales port, whereas often the closest port was in Queensland or Victoria. So again, you've got this path dependency. You've actually embedded in your grain supply chains an unnecessary expense. So you see, here we go, New South Wales grain heading a long way to Newcastle, whereas it really could have headed up to Brisbane, but we had different rail gauges. And the number of tracks that just sort of stop at the border, you know, sort of make it into New South Wales, it's state politics at work. Just, we talk about the national interest, and history tells us what a lie that is. And then the other issue, it gets back to this degradation of rail, is, and it's also a function of just the different gauges, is that we actually have a range of speed and axle limitations that apply. So when a track gets degraded, you have to reduce the rail speed. So that just adds to the expense. So in Australia, we've got a unit train. So a unit train is one that's about 90% of its capacity. It's 40 wagons, 50 tonnes each. So our unit trains deliver 2,000 tonnes. If you go to Canada, their unit trains are 100 wagons, 100 tonnes, 10,000 tonnes. So down the bottom, they can fill a 40,000 tonne grain ship with 4 of their trains. We have to run 20 of them. In Canada, it costs $40 a tonne to rail your grain 1,200. So if I'm sitting in Saskatoon, I've got 1,200 kilometres to get the grain out of Vancouver. It only cost me $40 a tonne. When we did our analysis across Australia, it ranges between $19 to $28 a tonne just to send it 200 kilometres. And these are examples of actual freight costs, so I won't go into that, but it has important implications. And another example is path dependencies. Receival sites were constructed for small farm bag-based grain production. So, no surprise, we've built all the infrastructure. We're now finding that it's difficult to close some of these low-volume sites for socio-political reasons. Everyone likes their local bin to stay open. But a consequence of that is you've got low traffic volumes and you just end up increasing the unit cost of rail and handling services. So in my studies I came across this. This is wonderful. This is a map of the rail and siding network in WA in 1935. Now look how close the sidings are. So in 1930, and 1935 was a bumper year, folks. It was one of our best ever. Just in this part, and remember we had a lot of agricultural expansion after 1935, but just then we had over 250 grain receival sites for our state harvest, which was a bumper year of 730,000 tonnes in 1935. Last year we had over 16 million tonnes and we had 195 sites. So we are closing sites, but It's not really happening very effectively because last year 35% of those sites received 80% of the grain. So we've got 65% of our sites receiving 20% of the grain, and you try and close those 65%. And yet their cost is embedded in supply chains. When you look at each receivable point in different jurisdictions, so you've got, these are the number of segregations. So by segregations, I'm talking about canola, lupins, barley. There's usually two types of barley, and then in wheat you've got different segregations like Australian premium white, noodles. So there's lots of different possible segregations. What you find is that in WA we've got more sites with more segregations. So we actually in Western Australia have the ability to receive a wider range of types and qualities of grain compared to South Australia or on the East Coast. However, we're moving towards fewer sites. So there's a set of advantages and disadvantages with site closures, and one of the future studies that I'd like to do is to actually flesh this out. As you close sites, who wins, who benefits? There's very few studies of this, and it'd be nice to have some objective information around the spatial economics. Examples of policy rigidities. We've got a lot more grain growing on roads, and no surprise here that grain growers and grain handlers are living off the cost externality, because the cost of taxes and licence fees paid by grain haulers are much less than the road damage costs that they incur. And Donna Brennan, who died about 3 years ago, did a very interesting paper that showed how rail owners, through exercising a spatial monopoly, can actually keep open some less efficient rail lines. So it's not a simple argument to place. The other issue with policy rigidity is that local ratepayers end up shouldering an inequitable share of the cost. So let's say you've got a really efficient grain site that attracts large volumes of trucks. So the trucks drive through a few shires and dump their grain at your siding. Who pays for all the damage? Usually the ratepayers in the shire in which the efficient receivable site is located. So they bear a higher cost burden. And there are lots of policy rigidities. Politicians are not keen to invest in rail. They are keen to invest in roads for a lot of political reasons. You can build roads very quickly, you can badge them, they've got more users other than grain haulage, so they tend to be preferentially. The other issue of policy rigidities are just the access burdens that are imposed. So ports are subject to ACCC access requirements. Talking to some of the bulk handlers, just putting in place those access arrangements have cost those bulk handlers millions and millions of dollars. Just basically, this is red tape, getting all the legal documentation, getting in place auction arrangements at ports. Hugely expensive. You know, going before the ACCC with all your QCs and gathering all the information, very expensive. Getting near the end, port fees, significant and rising. When we did an historical analysis, what we found is that port fees as a component of the supply chain costs are increasing. And when I spoke last week to the Victorian Farmers Federation and speaking to the CEO of Noble Grains, and they're one of the key partners in a new port terminal being constructed at Port Kembla. He was asked in public, why are you doing that? And one of the main reasons was that operating and owning a port is very profitable at the moment. And if you look at what's happening across Australia, all the new investments are in ports. So in Western Australia, you've got Bunge building port terminal or using port terminal at Bunbury. You've got the Haiyang Yang Feng Agricultural Group at Albany. Then you've got Noble Grains, that's Quattro Grain, coming out of Port Tembler. You've also got, you've got NAT. This is Newcastle Agri Terminal that's just been opened. That's a joint venture arrangement between Viterra, CBH and Olam. So all these new port terminals are being opened and constructed because A, the ports are a source of profit making, and if you also talk to these people and you ask them, why are you doing this? And typically they say that in order to make money out of exporting grain in Australia, you actually have to own the supply chain, have to own and operate it. And so the future of where we're heading with our grain supply chains is that there's going to be fewer operators, and they're almost all going to be owner-operators. So in spite of there being myriads of marketers, at the moment, or historically there was one, just the Australian Wheat Board. Currently there's about 23 licensed grain exporters, and there's usually only about 5 or 6 main ones. And you'll find all those 5 or 6 main ones, Cargill, Glencore, CBH, Emerald, they all own ports. They all own supply chains. So what are the key findings to wrap it up? Supply chain costs across Australia, 18 to 23% of the FOB price. In Australia, there's limited transparency in cost components, and I suspect that's going to worsen. Low density of grain production and volatile production increases our supply chain costs. Past dependencies, unfortunately, have locked us into having higher cost supply chains than otherwise would have occurred. And that port costs are rising faster. Now, there are several other findings, but I don't have time to go into them, and they're available in the report. So, Fiona.
Thanks, Ross.